I would like to start my presentation today with a quote from one of my favorite artists because it encapsulates my philosophy of life. The way to know life is to love many things. And I found that is true in my particular life and in my work as a life coach working with thousands of other people. I have also seen that at play in other people's lives. My first job out of college, I worked with the Bell system, and our department designed voice and data networks and sold them to the public. And I was in my office one day, and I hear this knock on the door. And this guy introduces himself. He says, "Hi, I'm Fred. I'm from the newspaper, and I've been tasked to come out here to AT&T and find the most interesting employee who works here, interview them, and write an article on them. And I'm about ready to have cardiac arrest about that point." And he says, "I came into the building the other day and walked around on the floors and randomly asked people, who's the most interesting person who works here?" And he looked in my face and he said, "Every single person gave me your name." That is one of the most humbling moments I have ever experienced in my life. I didn't know what to say. And he said, "Can I interview you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, anyway, go for it." Well, he interviewed me and he wrote this beautiful article and he called me a Renaissance man. And I didn't even know what that meant. I had to go look it up in a dictionary. And then I was, to be called that, I was humbled to the dust. I didn't know how anybody could call me that. The truth of the matter is, though, folks, I love life and always have. I love everything about this beautiful world we live in and the universe that it is a part of. I'd like to just show you some of my interest here to give a wider perspective to my presentation. I love drawing and painting. I love music, performance, and composition. I love snorkeling, scuba diving, and underwater photography. I love building high-performance automobile and motorcycle engines for other people as well. My profession for the last 30 years has been a professional speaker, workshop facilitator, and personal coach. I like to tell people that my life work and my joy is helping people rediscover their true selves, own their personal greatness, and shine that greatness brightly into the world by living their unique lives fully. And that's what I've endeavored to do in my life. I've been asked by the people here at Entrada to talk with you about another of my lifelong passions, and that is astronomy. And that's where we will keep our focus for the remainder of the presentation. This whole thing in my life started with two events. The first one was a very special birthday gift when I turned 12 years old. My parents took me to a department store and they let me choose something, and I'd always been into science. So I picked up this little 40 millimeter refractor and I took it home, and I will never forget the first time I directed it to the moon and racked in the focus. It almost took my breath away. And I think those of you who have experienced that in astronomy, your first views through a telescope, can remember that special experience. I couldn't believe that from my backyard I could literally explore another world. And I spent hours with this little refractor here, acquainting myself with everything on the moon. The problem is it came in a box with pictures of the Cone Nebula and the Crab Nebula and all these very, very dim deep space objects. I had a real hard time finding it with this little guy here. So that's part of the story as we go here. I ended up with a bigger telescope as time went on. The second thing that happened was an overnight camping trip as a Boy Scout. I had a very special scoutmaster, and he's no longer with us. And it is a blessing in my life that I crossed paths with that man as a young boy. We went hiking up above Bountiful, where I live in northern Utah, and we hiked down from Skyline Drive to this little grove of trees here. We set up our camps and got our cooking fires going and enjoyed sitting around the campfire. And as it got dark, the fire was ebbing. And our scoutmaster stood up and he says, "Is there anybody here who would like to go out and learn a little bit about the night sky?" And me and two other of the scouts said yes, and then everybody else kind of begged off and went to bed. And our scoutmaster walked us out to this little plateau here. He got out a red flashlight, and he got out one of these. What are these called?
Planisphere.
It's a planisphere. You can adjust it for any night of the year and hold it up to the night sky and see, learn the constellations. So he got his little red flashlight out and showed us his planisphere, and then he started showing us the constellations in the sky. And I thought, I'm really sorry. Life is a beautiful experience, and one of the most beautiful things is the people who cross our path and touch our lives deeply. This man was just... Anyway, he showed us the constellations in the night sky, and I was hooked for life. I couldn't get to the library fast enough. So when I got home, my next trip was to the local library. And I went right to the astronomy section, and I don't know what your local library is like, but mine, you could like check out like 12 books. So I loaded up and I took them up there, and the librarian's kind of looking at me because some of these are pretty heavy-duty astronomy text. And I went home and I poured through those books as a 12-year-old boy. I couldn't begin to understand some of the math and stuff in there, but I told myself, someday I'm going to learn to do this math so that I can understand how beautiful the universe is on a deeper level. And thus began my journey of learning about the night sky in a more academic way. Well, one day I was at the library because it became a regular stop on my itinerary now, and I walked by the magazine rack, and a magazine caught my eye. It was called Sky and Telescope. Anybody ever heard of Sky and Telescope? Well, I went over and sat down. I started thumbing through the Sky and Telescope, and I came to this page. Because all the books I'd been talking about were saying, if you want to get into astronomy, you need a serious telescope. Well, this was a picture of what I had seen in the books portrayed as a Sirius telescope. A Newtonian reflector on an equatorial mount with a clock drive so that it would, track the motion of the stars across the sky. Well, I had been a worker ever since I was a little boy. I worked for the local farmers, and I had $194. And I went and bought an RV6 Dynascope. And I started to learn the night sky. And it was really funny because when I was a young boy, not many people had telescopes. This was a real anomaly. I would set this up in the front yard, and it would be like a magnet. People would start coming, Mark, what are you looking at tonight? Would you like to see Saturn's rings? Have you ever seen Saturn before? You've got Saturn, you can see Saturn through your telescope? And all of a sudden, people started lining up, and then they'd say, well, when are you getting your scope out again, Mark? I had so much fun sharing my love of the night sky with other people. Here are my firsts. I'll never forget these. My first planet was Jupiter. I will never, ever forget pulling that into view and seeing another planet, and actually seeing the two major equatorial cloud belts across the planet and the 4 Galilean satellites, Ganymede, Europa, Callisto, and which one did I forget? Europa, Io, Callisto, and Ganymede. All lined up. And I thought, how cool is that? I'm looking at the very same thing that Galileo looked at all those years ago. I must have looked at that planet for like 15 minutes. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And then I thought, Mark, you can come out and set this up every night if you want. You can come out here anytime and look at the starry sky. My first double star was Albireo. One of the things that I thought before I got a telescope is that stars only came in what color? White. I pulled my telescope over Albireo and pulled Albireo into the frame, and I was greeted with one of the most beautiful sights I've ever seen in my life. A bright orange star next to a sapphire blue star, and I couldn't believe it. That's the day I learned that stars come in different colors. This is very interesting, by the way. There's still a debate going on as to whether Albireo is an actual orbiting double star. They postulate that if it is, the orbital period is around 100,000 years. But in the meantime, they've discovered that the bright component, the orange one, is also a double star, and it has an orbital period, I believe, 214 years. So we just learn more and more and more the more we ask questions and the more we search the starry sky. My first star cluster was M13. And by the way, these M designations come from who? Charles Messier, the great French comet hunter. What he was trying to do was catalog all the little fuzzy patches in the sky that weren't comets. So that when they're out there looking for comets, they go, oh, nope, that's not a comet, that's M, whatever it was. And anyway, he didn't give them the designations, that came later. But just so happened, as he identified most of the most interesting things in the sky that you can see with an amateur telescope, and so they're called the Messier objects today. Well, Messier 13 is a great globular star cluster in the constellation of Hercules. I will never forget when I racked in the focus on M13. It looked like somebody had taken 1,000 diamonds and thrown them onto black velvet. And I couldn't believe that there was something so cool that you could see in the starry sky. And in fact, M13 is where I learned to use what's called averted vision. And all of you people out there who are into astronomy understand that our retinas have cones and rods. The cones are our color receptors, the rods are the black and white. As we get toward the periphery of our retina, they have more rods. And so they're more sensitive to low light. So when you're looking at one of these little fuzzy things through a telescope, just look straight ahead and then turn your head slightly and let the light fall on the side of your retina, and you'll probably look like somebody just put a magnifying glass on the object. All of a sudden you're going to see more of those photons because those rods are very, very sensitive to that low light. Another interesting thing happened with M13. M13 is 22,180 light years from Earth. 1 light year is approximately 6 trillion miles. I started thinking and I thought, wait a minute. If that light's been traveling through space at 186,000 miles per second for 22,000 years, I'm seeing that object not as it is, but as that was. Telescopes are time machines. They are literally time machines. 200,000 stars packed in an area of 145 light years in diameter. Amazing. My first emission nebula, M8, better known as the... Come on, you astronomers. It's the Lagoon Nebula. I would have been disappointed, Lowell, if you hadn't known that. The Lagoon Nebula in Sagittarius. Let's see, it's 5,000 light years away, about 110 by 51 light years in diameter. This is an actual stellar nursery. New stars are actually being born. You can see those black areas within the nebula that are called Bach globules. That's protostar material that is actually coalescing and condensing into new stars. You are literally witnessing creation. New stars being born. My first planetary nebula, M57. Planetary nebulas are the remains of dying stars. Stars of lower mass end their life by sloughing off the outer layers of their atmosphere, and then all that remains is a little white dwarf. In fact, it's kind of humbling to know that that's how Sol, our sun, will end its life way in the future as a planetary nebula as well. But this is a fun thing to look at. It's like a little smoke ring, and it actually takes magnification really well. It's really one of the fun things to look at through an amateur telescope. My first galaxy, M81, or Boda's galaxy. 12 million light years away, 90,000 light years in diameter, 250 billion stars. I brought this into focus, and I will never ever forget this moment. It was just a hazy little patch in my telescope. But realizing that I was now looking at another island universe like the Milky Way, the galaxy that I live in. The little boy in me, who's never died, wondered, I wonder if there's a planet orbiting a star somewhere in that galaxy that maybe has life. And maybe some of that life is sentient. Maybe it's intelligent. Could it be possible that there's somebody in his or her backyard looking through his telescope right now at this very moment at my beautiful galaxy, the Milky Way? It was a very spiritual experience for me as a young man. I joined the Salt Lake Astronomical Society. Now, I am so happy that a gentleman is here today. I went up to an open house when I was a student at the university, and there was another student, I believe he was a graduate student at the time, He was actually on the roof of the South Physics Building, and he was operating the 16-inch reflector. And I got in there, and I was asking him all these questions. I think I was kind of a pest. And he says, "It sounds like you really like astronomy." He says, "You probably ought to join the Salt Lake Astronomical Society." Lowell, would you stand up for a second, please? I want to give you a hand. And it's not just because he was there that night. It goes way deeper than that. Lowell is one of those people that I've met in my life who has unselfishly shared his time, thousands of hours, to show other people the night sky. In fact, he's down here this week again to do the same thing. One of Earth's many unsung heroes that just quietly give and make the world a better experience for all of us. Anyway, because of Lowell, I joined the Salt Lake Astronomical Society. We met at the old Hanson Planetarium, and I started meeting lots of people who shared my love of the starry sky. I told you that earlier that people would come over to my house to look for my telescope. Many of them said, "Mark, you know so much about the sky, you ought to put a presentation together." So I started putting presentations together and got a slideshow. Well, one day somebody up at the University of Utah heard about it, and they said, "Would you come up and give our students a presentation on the night sky?" At the University of Utah? So I'm up there giving this presentation, and the students are asking these questions, and there was this one young lady in the audience that kept asking really cool questions. And afterwards I set up my telescope, and after a while I noticed that everybody had kind of gone except for one young lady. And she was still asking me questions. And I thought, man, she must really like astronomy. And then I started thinking, I think she likes me. There she is, right there. That is literally how I met my wife. So life is full of incredible synchronicities. It's so fun to look at all the tapestry of life and how it weaves together for each of us. And so my wife and I, we became very active in the Salt Lake Astronomical Society. Here's actually, I kept this. This is actually a flyer for that star party where I met my wife. They're back in 1983. We started participating in a lot of star parties, and the Salt Lake Astronomical Society, one thing they did really cool back then, we would have conjoint star parties with other star clubs. And we held one at Dinosaur National Monument with the Denver Astronomical Society. And that was so fun. You know, one of the funnest things about a star party is you walk around and you get to talk to other people who are passionate about sky, but you also get to look through their telescopes. And that is so fun to just go around and sample the different telescopes, you know. And that's the best way to decide what you want to buy, by the way, and I'll talk about that later. Anyway, here's my Schmidt-Cassegrain. I'm getting ready to do a little piggyback photography when the sun goes down. Some of my early favorite books. By the way, where are the young people in here?
Canyon's back there, I know he is.
I'll tell you what, my friends, because not enough hands went up. I see some older people on the outside, but they're just as young still on the inside, aren't you? Oh, aren't you still young on the inside? You are. We have these old faces, but we're still young on the inside. The passion of my life has always been learning. I love to learn about everything. And my next greatest passion is once I've learned it, I want to share it with other people, right? So I started reading everything that I could find, and I would buy some things from my library. This is my favorite book that I have ever bought. It's still my favorite book I've ever bought on telescopes, All About Telescopes by Sam Brown. And the reason I love this is because Sam helped me fall in love with mathematics because he made it visual. All of a sudden, mathematics was no longer mysterious to me because somebody was explaining it visually. And I'm a visual person. And all of a sudden, math started falling into place for me. I thought, this is fun. This is beautiful. I want to learn more about math. Thank you, Sam Brown. Thank you, Sam Brown, for touching my life in a very deep way. Norton Star Atlas. Lowell probably has most of these books. This was at my telescope with me for years. It has star charts. They've cut the night sky up into star charts. You can see I've taken a red pen and I've drawn in all the constellations. And then I made myself a template with the field of view of my finders and my wide field eyepieces so that I could put them around here and star hop with it. This became very helpful when I started buying Dobsonian telescopes, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but still the favorite star atlas I've ever bought, and one of my favorite books. My Encyclopedia of Astronomy. Burnham's Celestial Handbook. Written by Robert Burnham. He was an astronomer at the Lowell Observatory in northern Arizona. And he took the sky constellation by constellation and wrote everything about it. The cosmology, the mythology, lists of double stars, lists of galaxies and deep space objects. And you know how a lot of people like to sit in bed at night and read novels? I would sit in bed at night and read Northern Star Atlas. Still, some of my favorite books that I have ever bought. The Messier album. This was the catalyst that got me into astrophotography. A gentleman by the name of Edward Kramer in Prescott, Arizona had a 12.5-inch Newtonian. This is a big one. This is a 16. He had a 12.5-inch cave reflector, and he built a custom cold camera where he could put a piece of dry ice in it, and he cut single frames of black and white film, and he would cool the film down so that the film would not lose its ASA reading when you take exposures longer than 1 second. It would hold its speed a little bit. Anyway, he took pictures of all the Messier objects. And I went through here, and I couldn't believe how beautiful this was. Now, anybody who would look through this book in 2023 would say, well, those aren't very impressive pictures. And they're not by 2023 standards, but by 1970 standards, they were more than awesome. And this was the catalyst, again, that got me interested in astrophotography as time went on. One of the guys in the Salt Lake Astronomical Society, Scott Crosby, we were talking one night at the meeting, and he says, Mark, my dad and I just built an observatory in our backyard. Would you like to come see it? I said, an observatory in your backyard? Well, we went to visit it. He showed us around. My wife will never forget this. We were driving home, and as we were leaving Scott Crosby's driveway, a dream was planted in my heart. And I told my wife, someday I'm going to have an observatory in my backyard. My early adventures with astrophotography. I bought a little T-ring from my 35mm Pentax camera and an adapter, and I started taking some pictures. Now, you can laugh if you want. They're not very impressive. These are literally the very first pictures I ever took through a telescope. Okay? Got Jupiter, Saturn, an eclipse of the moon, and then the surface of the moon. This was on old Ektachrome, I think 400 film, Ektachrome 400 film. Again, not very impressive, but those are over 40 years old.
Yeah.
Very impressive for 40 years old.
Yeah.
You're a kind soul, thank you.
No, it's true.
Remember that little star party I showed you at Dinosaur National Monument? That was the first night I tried piggyback photography. That's where you actually put your camera on top of your telescope, and the telescope's guiding across the sky, and you use a wide-angle lens and take a picture through a regular camera. Well, I had bought a special roll of gas hypersensitized Fujichrome 400 film. And what they did back then, I don't want to get into chemistry here, but they would soak the film in kind of warmed up a mixture of hydrogen and nitrogen gas at just a slight pressure. And what it would do is it would get rid of the moisture in the film and the contaminants. And again, it would allow the film to keep its high ASA rating for longer than a 1 second exposure, right? So I took some pictures, and I entered this in our yearly contest, and I won first place for Salt Lake Astronomical Society with the first time I ever tried piggyback photography. And I was proud of that, I will admit that. Okay, this is probably the funnest night I ever had in my life doing astrophotography. It was in 1988. My wife and I got in our four-wheel drive truck. We drove up some dirt road in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. I didn't even know where we were. We come up about over 9,000 feet high. We come around this turn, and there was a perfect place to pull our truck off. And I walked across the road, and it fell off, and the whole southern exposure, horizon to horizon, was open to me. I set up my telescope, again put my camera piggybacked on top with a 135mm lens and a cable release, and I used some of Konicka's new 3200 ASA film that I had gas hypersensitized. Now, as you're looking at these pictures, some of you are going, Mark, those aren't very good. Why are you showing those to us? Those are not stacked exposures. Those are not photoshopped. This is how they came back from the photo lab. You people who've been around as long as I have, can you imagine when you opened your packet of photographs and the photographs looked like that back then? I was beyond thrilled. Combining business with pleasure. As mentioned, I'm a professional speaker. I've taught workshops all over the world. Franklin Covey, Daytimer, everybody else. Anyway, I was out doing a retreat one time for a corporation in the summer, and they had hired another speaker to come right after me, and this guy was talking on a fun topic. They always hire me for the business ones. And I thought, companies pay for fun topics too? And I thought, well, I got a fun topic. You guys stay overnight. How about a star party? So I started, this is the actual flyer I did in the early 90s, and I started selling star parties with my business workshops. And that was really fun. They would stay overnight at places like you have here, your little, campgrounds and stuff, and I would go do business in the day and astronomy in the evening. Okay, those of you who are in astronomy, I will bet at some point you have this little desire deep inside to actually go to what I've come to call the temples of astronomy. The places where the great discoveries of our universe have come from. And so early on, I wanted to do that. The first one I ever visited was Lick Observatory in the South Bay. I was doing technical training in Santa Clara, California, and it was 2 weeks and we had to stay over. And so I asked a couple of guys in my class, I said, would you guys like to go down and see Lick Observatory? And so we piled in the car and we went down to Lick Observatory. I got to see the 120-inch reflector and the 36-inch refractor. It was just amazing. In 2004, my wife and I actually went to go scuba diving down in Playa del Carmen, another one of our interests. And we were sitting there, I thought, why don't we get in the car and drive over to Chichen Itza? So we cruise out through the jungle and we ended up at Chichen Itza. And I can't believe that I got to stand in front of that thing I've seen in so many books along the way. El Caracal, the snail, built in 906 AD by the Mayans. It's called the snail because it has a spiral staircase inside of it, but that's a Mayan observatory. Mount Palomar. I will never forget my first visit to Mount Palomar because in my research I had discovered that the Schmidt telescope, the 48-inch Schmidt telescope and the 200-inch telescope working in tandem had been responsible for many of the major discoveries in the 20th century of astronomy. And here I was. These pictures were taken at another trip in 2008 when I took my family with me. By the way, I was speaking at Utah Valley University, and Dr. Joe Jensen over the astronomy department there, we got talking. He says, Mark, I went to Caltech. I did my undergraduate at Caltech, and they administer Mount Palomar. He says, one day my professor was doing some research, and he says, would you like to go down to Mount Palomar with me? I'm going to do some work on the telescope tonight. So they get down to Mount Palomar, and the sky's not cooperating. There's just patchy. So his professor calls down to the technician, and he says, slow the 200-inch telescope to Saturn. And he got to look at Saturn through the 200-inch Hale telescope with an eyepiece. I'm thinking, life's not fair, Oh, that was just so cool. In 2011, my wife and I went to Kitt Peak. Anybody here ever been to Kitt Peak? They have the most wonderful public outreach. They had a little box dinner. They give it to you. They have a beautiful presentation in the visitor center. Then they have this big deck outside. They pass out 20 by 50 binoculars and planispheres, and you all go out on the deck, and then the docent starts pointing out stuff with a laser printer in the night sky, and everybody can get their binoculars to look at it. I thought, well, how cool is this? And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven in terms of public outreach, and then she said, I need to divide you into 5 groups. I think it was 5 or 6 groups. And so she divided up, and each group was sent to one of the observatories on the top of Kitt Peak, and we got to look through the actual research telescopes on Kitt Peak at the universe for about an hour and a half. One of the greatest public outreach programs of any observatory. Well, it is the greatest one of any I've been to. In 1986, we went to Hawaii to see Halley's Comet, and it was a big disappointment. Halley's Comet didn't turn out to be very great, but we had planned to go to the top of Mauna Kea to see the observatories and it got rained out. So when we went back in 2016, my wife and I decided to go up to the top of Mauna Kea. When you get to 9,200 feet, there's a visitor center, and they say, please stay here for at least a half hour before proceeding up to 13,802 feet. Let your body acclimate to that. So we put in the requisite time, we hopped in our Jeep and we go up the road, and it is steep. Up the road we go. At about 10,500 feet, we're looking back down at the visitor center. It's right there, if I can not shake. But what was even more beautiful than that, can you see across the top deck? You can see Mauna Loa, the great shield volcano that forms the southern end of the big island of Hawaii, is peeking up above the cloud deck. Up we go. Right as we got toward the top, the road was paved. Does anybody know why they paved the road at the top of Mauna Kea?
Dust.
It's the dust. To keep the dust off of those world-class instruments. So they paved the road. And then I turned the corner, and I was in nirvana for astronomer. Sitting there is the James Clerk Maxwell telescope, the Caltech telescope, the Subaru telescope, the twin domes of the Keck telescope. And I was so lucky on that day, it was clear, and I got to take pictures of all the observatories on top of Mauna Kea. But here's something serious. When I got out to take my pictures, I turned around and I couldn't find my wife. And I got worried. I went around, she was doubled over, and she was deathly sick with altitude sickness. And so I piled her in there, and I didn't know how low I had to get her, but I went hauling down that road, and it was scary, but I learned something very important that day. Everybody's physiology is different. And you really have to respect what your body, how it reacts to that. So be nice if you ever decide to go to Mauna Kea. Sea level to 13,800 feet in 35 miles. A dream comes true. Young people. Where's my young at heart who have older faces? You don't need to answer this question because the question's yes. How many of you still have dreams right here? Keep them there. Don't ever let them go. And don't especially let any other person ever tell you that you can't live your dreams. Because you can. I was 50 years old when my dream to have an observatory came true. I designed and built Pleasant Valley Observatory in my backyard. First light was 2006. Lowell, I believe you came to the open house
I think I did.
all those years ago.
If there was food, I was there.
As a matter of fact, there was quite a spread that night. I had taught at many universities around the country a plethora of subjects. I had just finished teaching a class for the Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Utah on Sir David Brewster and kaleidoscopes. It was called Kaleidoscopes, the Science and the Art, and I explained the science of creating a kaleidoscope. And then I created kits so everybody in the class could build a kaleidoscope. And everybody really enjoyed it. I love teaching math that way. There's a fun way to teach math. Anyway, the leadership at Osher Institute of Lifelong Learning, they came to me and said, we understand another one of your interests is astronomy. I says, that's right. They said, would you be willing to create a semester-long course on astronomy for a lay person and take us from planet Earth to the very frontiers of the universe? And I did. I called it The Marvels and Mysteries of Our Universe. And it was a semester-long course. It was packed. For the last class, I set up my Dobsonian at Red Butte Garden and Arboretum, and I showed the students many of the objects we had talked about in the class. They asked me to come back. Unfortunately, I couldn't because I was traveling heavily with my business at the time, teaching other classes that weren't near as fun around the world. In 2015, I replaced the heavy 1,000-pound dome I had originally constructed. I was getting older, and as you get older, you're not as strong, and it was getting hard to turn a 1,000-pound dome. So I bought a commercial dome that I can turn with 2 fingers. One of the best things that I ever did. Here's inside my observatory. People say, why do you have a big tall pier in your observatory? Well, because my observatory is in the north of my yard, my house is in the south, and I have to be able to see over my house. So I have an observing platform inside of my observatory. Continuing adventures. In 2017, we went to southeast of Shoshone, Wyoming, right in the path of totality. It was so funny because I found this little dirt road off the main drag, and the main drag wasn't a main drag by that time, it was a 2-lane road. Anyway, I set up my tent. My tent was pretty bright, about a mile off the road. all of a sudden cars would put on their brakes, back up. They must have thought I knew what I was doing. Long story short, we had a whole camp that was international in scope. I had the Germans on this side, the Australians on this side. It was a major party, and we all got to enjoy the eclipse. One of the most beautiful things that I have ever seen in my life. How many of you saw the eclipse of 20? Well, I'm singing to the choir in here, right? I will never forget the moment of totality. All of a sudden, there wasn't a sun or a moon anymore for a second. And then all of a sudden, boom, the corona comes out and the dancing tendrils of light. I was sitting there with my 35 millimeter camera trying to take pictures with one hand and look with my eyes. My friends are laughing at me. Mark, you're just too over the top, Anyway, that's not a bad picture for a shaky hand. Okay, people ask me all the time, they say, where are your favorite places to view the stars? You people in Torrey are going to know what the answer is. I say they all happen to be in southern Utah. And not all of them, but most of them. This is, the top picture is on the way to Dead Horse Point over in Moab. There's a great big shelf of slick rock there that's a really fun place that I like to go. This lower picture is northeast of Hanksville on the other side of Capitol Reef National Park over in the Badlands. And again, all this area down here, Bortle 1 skies? Can we believe that, my friends? Do you know what my observatory in Bountiful, Utah is? It's Bortle 5. It is amazing, the dark skies down here. And if you've never looked through a telescope at a dark sky, it's just not the same experience. And so you guys are blessed with that beautiful dark sky. In 2019, I got a call from Lowell Lyon, no less. And he said, Mark, we're all heading up to Wolf Creek with our Dobsonians to do some deep sky stuff. Do you want to go? I said, do you mind if I just bring my telescope and do a little astrophotography? He says, no. So I brought my Schmidt Cassegrain and took some piggyback photography. I waited till everybody went to bed because everybody had their laser pointers going all over the way. See, it's over here. And I think, well, that's okay. They were doing visual astronomy. That's okay. But I waited till everybody was in bed about 1 in the morning, and then I started taking pictures. And I took a number of them. Here is one of the pictures I took that night. That is a single exposure, 1600 ISO, 3 minutes of the center of our galaxy. And the great big bright thing there is Jupiter. It's an overexposed Jupiter. But that shows you, again, when you get away from the city lights, it's amazing what you can see. And nothing magical there. You just kind of have to do a little bit of study to know how to get those kinds of pictures. Anyway, I showed it to somebody, and they said, that's really good, Mark. In fact, it's more than good. So I entered it in the fair and got a blue ribbon. And then the editor of Salt Lake Astronomical Society's newsletter asked if they could feature it on the cover. So I felt honored. Now, this is the most beautiful thing that ever happened at Pleasant Valley Observatory in 2019. This guy came by my house, this young man, and he says, Mr. Swain, is that an observatory in your backyard? And I says, yeah, would you like to go out and see it? And I took him out, and he says, I don't want to be weird here, but he says, my girlfriend is studying physics at the University of Utah, and she loves the stars. Could I propose to my girlfriend in your observatory? So we put a little plan together, and I said, what I'll do is we'll be up on the stand, and I'll show you my most beautiful star. That's your cue. So I sent her to Alberio, and I said, I got to show you, this is my favorite, most beautiful star. And then I kind of just went down the platform, and I left the two young people in there. And he turns down to Cassandra there, and he gets down on his knees, and he says, Cassandra, he says, you're my most beautiful star. Would you marry me?
Oh, that's cool.
My wife and I got to see that. People don't usually get to be a witness to those kinds of things. That was the most beautiful thing that ever happened. In fact, in June, we invited Zach and Cassandra and their extended family back over to our backyard for a celebration starbecue. Okay? To have a barbecue and look at the night sky. In 2020, I just took a tripod up the street to the elementary school and got a few pictures of Neowise. Did any of you see Neowise? Yeah. That was actually a pretty decent comet. Okay, here I am getting ready to host a star party in my backyard. There's inside of my observatory, and I'm collimating the optical train of my 16-inch Dobsonian there on the right. Here's the group inside. What I like to do nowadays is I let people hook their cell phones up to my telescope in the observatory and take pictures of the sky. Those are single exposures. Those aren't stacked or photoshopped or anything. I mean, that shows what you can see just through a moderate little telescope in an observatory. Here are some of the videos on my YouTube channel. I have all my interests on my YouTube channel, but here's some of the astronomy ones. I just did this one, the one on the corner here. I did this last fall. Somebody had been complaining to me and said, well, I can't afford all that stuff to do astrophotography with. So I did this video to show people what you can do with a simple tripod and a DSLR camera from your back patio in a Bortle 5 sky. That picture of the North American Nebula is what I took that night on my back patio. So you don't have to spend an arm and a leg to do astronomy. 2 frequent questions. Do you ever become afraid of the dark? I've had this a lot. My family knows this. I've said this many times. When I walk into my observatory and I close the door and I open the shutter, I almost get giddy. And in the early morning hours while the city sleeps, I luxuriate in the quiet darkness. Then it's just me and my friends in the starry sky. Some of my most beautiful memories in my life are just sitting there in the quiet of the night. I love this quote, so my daughter made this beautiful little plaque to hang in my observatory. I have loved the stars too fondly to be fearful of the night. Have you ever seen anything strange while you were stargazing?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen a lot of things. Probably the most fantastic one we ever saw, I was up at Soapstone in the Uinta Mountains doing a star party for a big group. And I had just showed them Saturn, and I was slowing the telescope to M13, and there was people started saying, what's that? What's that? What's that? Finally, somebody said, Mark, what's that? And I looked up, and it looked like a satellite. It was moving pretty quick. And somebody says, well, I said, well, it's a satellite. And they said, well, then what's that? And somebody says, well, what's that? Well, it turns out there are 5 objects converging on a common point in the sky, all going the exact same velocity from like equidistant points around this point, and they're all converging on a point. So I said, hey, let's just watch. They get to the point. We all sit there for about 5 seconds, and one guy goes, Mark, what was that? And I said, well, that's why there's a term unidentified flying object. I don't know what it is. It was flying. I have no idea what it was. Congratulations, you've seen UFO. Okay? But we've seen some really interesting stuff over the years. I collect a lot of things. Here are some of my collections. One of the things I love about astronomy is it's one of the few things in the world where nobody can buy or take away the greatest specimens and hide them away in their private collection. The night sky is forever available for every human being. I like that. It's the people's hobby. We can all collect those beautiful things in the night sky. Lessons learned along the way. Here's your chance to listen to somebody who's done this for a lot of years. You don't need to spend a lot of money to enjoy the night sky. A blanket, a chair, and 2 eyes. You can enjoy it for the rest of your life. If you want to add a little money, you buy a planisphere, learn the constellations. You have an app on your phone nowadays. You just hold it up and it tells you what the constellation is. You know, if you really want to get extravagant, I picked up these 11 by 50 binoculars online for $30. And the optics are insanely good. For $30, and with 10 by 50 binoculars, you can see many of the Messier objects and actually see them quite good. So, no, you don't have to spend a lot of money, but you can, but you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of money to enjoy the night sky. Bigger isn't better. Please listen to this if you haven't bought a telescope and you're thinking of it. Just because you can afford a big telescope doesn't mean you should buy one, okay? Because you have to wonder about how are you going to get it around? How portable is it? Okay? And as you get older like I am, heavy matters, you know? I have a friend my age, and he found this great deal on this huge telescope in another state, and he drove down there to get it. He doesn't even get it out of his garage. The best telescope is the telescope you will use the most. Okay? And for me, it's my little telescope. Recommendations. Okay, Mark, what kind of telescope should I buy? I've never bought a telescope. Well, if you're primarily interested in visual work, I'm going to suggest that you buy a Newtonian reflector. A Newtonian reflector, you can get more aperture for your dollar than any other telescope design. It uses mirrors to gather and focus the light, right? And I would suggest that you get a Dobsonian. A Dobsonian is simply an altitude azimuth mount made out of plywood, and you set the telescope in the box. It was invented by Dobson in 1965, and it's a very, very simple mount. In fact, here's a picture. That's a picture of me right next door in July when I came down here to talk to some of the board members, and I set my telescope up that night and we looked at the night sky. That's a 16-inch Dobsonian. I would suggest a 6 or 8-inch Dobsonian as a starter telescope. You can see just many, many things. In fact, you might not ever buy another telescope. That will be so good for you. I just checked the prices when I made this. You can get that for about $300 to $800, depending on how fancy you want to get with your telescope. That's something that you can really afford if you really want to. Okay, for astrophotography, I would suggest a small refractor. 50 to 80 millimeters objectives with fast optics, probably somewhere like I got down here, f5 to f7 in there. A refractor uses lenses to refract the light down to the focus. Here is my astrophotography setup. This is my back patio again. It's an 80 millimeter Celestron refractor. It's 20 years old. I have it on a Skywatcher HEQ5 Pro mount. I have an Astro modified DSLR camera, Canon, and then I have my laptop there. So here's what it costs. About $3,000 my setup there is without the laptop or the camera. So it's not cheap to buy something like that. But if you're going to get into astrophotography, I have one great suggestion for you. Spend your money on the mount. You can have a half-decent telescope on a really good mount and take good pictures. You can have a really good telescope on a bad mount, and you're going to be very disappointed. You have to have something that's very, very stable. The pictures you see here were all taken from my patio in July. The Great Globular Cluster, M13, the Andromeda Galaxy, and the Dumbbell Nebula, all taken through my little 80 millimeter refractor right from my Bortle 5 Sky patio. I have to keep saying that. You guys, I'm going to rub it in. You know, your mayor here's got the big green, says, we have Bortle 1 Skies, Mark. You ought to come down here. You know, I probably ought to more. Okay, let's see. Have patience with yourself. There's so much to learn. How many of you in here are primarily into visual astronomy? How many like astrophotography? Okay. Don't compare yourself with somebody else. Just do it for the sheer love and the joy. And that's how to really enjoy something in life. It's not about comparing. It's just about learning, enjoying, and sharing. That's what life is really about. In fact, that's the segue to the next point. Share your love of the starry sky with other people. Here's something I can tell you, and I'm a little bit older, I'm 67. The greatest joy in life comes from finding what brings you joy and then sharing that joy with other people. There is nothing on earth that will bring you more joy than sharing your joy and your passion with other people. And your joy will go up exponentially. Let's throw a little math in there, okay? It's not linear. It will go up exponentially. Very important lesson. A number of years ago, I was driving my motorcycle around town, and I happened to drive by Scott Crosby's house. And he was out washing his side-by-side in the driveway, and I thought, I had to stop and say hi to Scott. And I thought, I'm busy, and he looks busy, so I headed up the road, and I felt this increasing compulsion inside to turn my motorcycle around and go back and see Scott. I ignored it until I got to the intersection, and it was so strong I was compelled to turn my motorcycle around. I went back, took off my helmet. When he saw who it was, a big grin came on his face. We talked. We spent the whole morning. We ended up out in his observatory laughing. I spent one of the most beautiful times I have ever had with another human being. 3 months later, I heard he passed. August 24th, AD 79. The citizens of Pompeii had just sat down to enjoy their major meal of the day, which by tradition at that time took place at noon. Mount Vesuvius violently erupted and rained pumice and ash down on this little resort community. And if that wasn't enough, it eventually unleashed a pyroclastic flow of superheated hot gas that basically killed the people. Now, how many of those people do you think woke up that morning thinking, gee, today's my last day on earth? But it was. See, you and I go around thinking that we have a lease on life. In fact, have any of you ever said this to yourself? Don't raise your hands. Someday I'm going to fill in the blank. Who says you have a someday? I suggest that you live life to the fullest as you go and do what you can to do the things that bring you joy. When they unearthed Pompeii in modern times and they uncovered the 7 meters of ash, irony of ironies, they found this carved in the wall of a public building. My wife and I often talk about all the things we had missed out in our life if we had been averse to hassle. Is it easy to go on an astronomy camping trip? No, you got to get all the gear. You got to make sure you got everything. You pack it all. You take it there. You unpack it. You set up your camp. You polar line your telescope. Yada yada. I could go on and on. And you get home and you have to reverse the process. But we talk all the time. If we had been averse to hassle, all the things in our life, the wonderful experiences, we would have foregone. Well, last year I hadn't done any astrophotography, and it was getting late in the year, and I said, well, I'm going to Wolf Creek, we're going to do astrophotography. And it was cloudy, and I said, we're packing up anyway, we're going to Wolf Creek. Well, we got up there, and it was cloudy. So we set up our camp, we did some hiking, we took some pictures, we went to bed. I woke up at 1 in the morning, and I thought, I wonder if it's clear outside. And I thought, it sure is cozy here in the tent. Maybe I'll just roll over and go back to sleep. And then my good little voice on this shoulder said, Mark, excuse me, why did we come here tonight? I thought we came here to take pictures of the starry sky. So Mark gets out of bed, and I go out, and the sky is cloudy. So I sat in my little camping chair, and I just luxuriated in the quiet, profound darkness at 9,200 feet for an hour. And then the sky started opening up. And I grabbed my tripod and my camera, and I ran down the road trying to find a place to take a picture. And the image you see in the background of the northern Milky Way is the picture I took that night. Here is a quote from my book I wrote. Do you want to live your dreams? Or do you want to wish you had lived your dreams? We all have that choice. It's a choice we make every day that we live. I started with a quote by Vincent van Gogh. The way to know life is to love many things. I would like to close by showing you his masterwork, The Starry Night. I love this painting because I believe it portrays the night sky as it truly is. Dynamic, in motion, and profoundly beautiful. Thank you for letting me talk to you today about my love of the starry sky. Clear skies, everyone.